Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. This is the second episode of the podcast, and today's episode will introduce the ancient world, which is the first series of the podcast. The 25 episodes of this series will be broken into two units. The first unit is called Prehistory, and the second unit is called Civilizations of the Ancient Near East. The music that I played at the beginning of this episode is from a piece called Night Vigil by Kevin MacLeod. Now, a night vigil is a prayer service typically held in a monastic setting, although devout Christians of any background might participate in such a liturgy. In the Catholic Church, this prayer service is known as matins, from the Latin word matutinum, which means morning. It marks the beginning of the coming day, even though it is typically held during the dark of night. You see, in the most ancient interpretations of day and night, each day actually began the night before. This is why the Jewish Sabbath begins on Friday night, even though Saturday is technically the Sabbath day. Saturday begins, you see, when the sun sets on Friday. This is also why the biblical account of creation marks the days the way that it does in Genesis chapter 1, verse 5. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. So the day begins in the darkness of night. Sunrise only comes when the day is already several hours old. I chose this music then, first of all, because it probably evokes images of something very medieval, such as monks rising in the middle of the night to mark the beginning of the day. And while the Middle Ages will not be discussed until the fourth series of podcasts, the medieval period remains the touchstone of Western civilization. It is the period in which the West finds its identity, even if the roots of that identity stretch back thousands of years before the rise of Charlemagne. But I also chose this music because our study of history, just like an ancient day in the Hebrew calendar, begins in darkness. The past, you see, can be broken into two unequal pieces of time. There is history and there is prehistory. We apply the title of history to any time period after which a given culture begins to produce written records of its existence. Obviously, determining the exact point in time at which this occurs is debatable. One might say that history begins with the Bible, for instance, since this document attests to some of the most ancient activities of humans on the planet. And one might say the same thing about Greek or Egyptian or Sumerian mythology. However, by convention, historians tend to mark the start of history sometime around 5,000 years ago, or a little before that, when large cities first appeared in the Mesopotamian river basin. Now, a couple centuries ago, before the ruins of those cities were discovered, historians would have possibly placed the starting point of history 1,000 years later than that, maybe around 2500 BC, with the appearance of pyramids in Egypt. It may be that this historical frontier will be pushed back even farther by the time that you finish the series of this podcast. Nevertheless, the period of time that comes before the beginning of history, whenever that was, is known as prehistory. The world and human civilization existed before the rise of cities in Mesopotamia, but the records that we have of that time period are either fragmented or non-existent. Now, earlier I said that our past is broken into two unequal pieces. Officially, true history comprises only the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. And we set that limit because we do not find solid evidence of writing before that era. What came before the beginning of history, then, is called prehistory. Prehistory, though, would consist of more than just the thousands of years during which humanity roamed the world as clans of hunter-gatherers. Instead, the title of prehistory applies to the unimaginable amount of time that came before anything even resembling a man ever walked the earth. If science is right about the age of the universe, then we are talking about the many billions of years that the universe existed before the appearance of human beings. Prehistory, then, is truly a time of darkness. We know very little about whatever came before Egypt and Sumer. Occasionally, we get glimpses and hints of human events before those civilizations. A few decades ago, the discovery at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey surprised everyone. Here were ruins of a society of men and women who were able to erect large structures and decorate them competently with realistic art. The structures were ultimately determined to be over 10,000 years old, more than twice as old as the pyramids. But that is still prehistory. The ruins at Göbekli Tepe and other sites discovered since then do not show any signs that the people who built them were able to write. So there is no way to turn such discoveries into official history. Göbekli Tepe just sheds a little light on the darkness of human antiquity without dispelling the dark completely. But no matter how far back we push the bounds of official written history, there will always be a darkness at the beginning. Whether we believe the accounts of the Bible or some other religious text, or we believe the latest scientific update about the beginning of the universe, there will always be a darkness before the dawn of time. Let there be light, God says in the opening verses of the Bible. Before that, then, there must have been darkness. So the first unit of episodes will address what little we know about human life before the rise of civilization. The second unit of episodes in this series, then, will be about the ancient civilizations of the Near East. This term, the Near East, refers to Egypt and Mesopotamia and to all the lands in between them and right around them. Now, the ancient Near East may seem to be an unusual topic for a podcast about Western civilization. When we think of Western history and culture, the Middle Ages might first come to mind, or perhaps you might think about the history of the Greeks and the Romans. But as I intend to show with the coming episodes, it is impossible to consider the history of the West without unearthing its roots in the history of the Near East. The introduction of the Bible into Greek and Roman circles over 2,000 years ago has much to do with this intermingling of Western and Near Eastern histories. If the Greeks and the Romans and the Celts and the Norse and others in Europe had not become Christians, then the histories of East and West might have remained defined and separate. But the Bible, which came with the Christian religion into the West, speaks of times and cultures that are primarily Near Eastern. In the pages of that book, we encounter settings in ancient Egypt and in Babylon and in the Persian Empire and in other Near Eastern cultures. And since the Bible has become such a fundamental text in the West, our history is therefore intertwined with the history of the Middle East. As the episodes of the second unit will show, however, it may be that this interlacing of Western and Eastern history was inevitable. Herodotus was a Greek writer who lived during the 5th century BC. He's sometimes called the father of history because he wrote the first secular history of the world as he knew it. And Herodotus devoted nearly half of that Greek history to matters pertaining to Egypt, to the ancient Hittites, to the Babylonians, and to the Persians, and others in the Near East. Maybe then the history of the West has always had Eastern roots. In any event, then, the second unit of episodes in this first series will delve into what we know about the history of ancient Egypt and of other civilizations in that region of the world. The very next episode in this podcast will properly introduce, then, the first unit of episodes about the prehistorical period. And until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.